In the pre-dawn darkness of May 21st, 1945, a 17-year-old girl named Ko Tanaka crouched inside a limestone cave on Okinawa. Her white nursing uniform was torn and stained, her hands trembling as she clutched a rusty pair of scissors, the only tool she had left to treat the endless stream of wounded soldiers. For 3 months, she and her classmates from the Himeyuri Student Corps had been living in the shadows of these caves, performing surgeries by candlelight, tearing their own clothes into bandages, and whispering prayers that their emperor's promised victory would arrive before their strength gave out. Then, on that morning, something happened that shattered everything she thought she knew about the war. As American voices echoed at the cave's entrance, one medic stepped forward. He did not point a weapon. He did not shout. Instead, he handed her a small, brown package and spoke a single word in broken Japanese. Chocorato. Chocolate. Ko stared at it in disbelief. She had been told Americans were starving, desperate, barely clinging to survival. Yet here they were, offering a luxury she had never even tasted. That first bite of sweetness would open a door to a truth more powerful than any weapon, that everything she had been taught about the enemy was a lie. This is not just a story about chocolate. It's the story of how young Japanese women, raised on propaganda about their nation's inevitable triumph and America's supposed weakness, discovered a different reality in the most unexpected way. It's about how food's simple, ordinary meals became instruments of transformation, breaking through fear, reshaping loyalties, and revealing the industrial strength that truly decided the war in the Pacific. In this journey, you'll see how the Himeyuri students went from classrooms filled with patriotic songs to caves filled with suffering, how Japanese propaganda painted Americans as weak and starving, only for the women to find themselves eating bread, butter, and fresh vegetables in American captivity, how each meal, from chocolate bars to beef stew, forced them to confront the lies they had believed. And finally, how these women carried their experiences into the post-war world, becoming voices for reconciliation and peace. But more than history, this is also a story about us, about how easily human beings can be shaped by stories we are told, and how quickly those stories can unravel when reality finally breaks through. So I invite you to step into that cave on Okinawa, to taste that first bite of chocolate through the eyes of a girl who had been promised victory but found herself holding defeat, and to ask yourself, what truths in our own world today might be waiting to be uncovered, hidden beneath the comforting lies we've been told? Let's begin. If you want us to keep uncovering the hidden stories of World War II, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of World War II. Your support helps us continue the journey. 1. The world of the Himeyuri Student Corps. They were not soldiers. They were schoolgirls. In the spring of 1945, most of them were still in pressed uniforms, carrying notebooks filled with chemistry problems and poetry. They were the daughters of shopkeepers, farmers, and civil servants in Okinawa. Bright, hopeful, and disciplined, raised to believe that their greatest honor was to serve their country. When the Japanese military came to their schools in Naha and Shuri, asking for volunteers to support the war effort, nearly every girl raised her hand. How could they refuse? For years, they had sung patriotic songs each morning, bowed before the emperor's portrait, and been told that Japan's destiny was divinely guided. To serve as nurses for the wounded was presented as a noble calling. They imagined neat white wards, clean beds, and the chance to comfort heroes who would soon march on to victory. Reality was different. The Himeyuri Student Corps, nearly 240 girls between the ages of 15 and 19, along with their teachers, were dispatched not to hospitals, but to the dark underworld of limestone caves carved into Okinawa's hills. These were not places of healing, but of despair. The air was heavy with smoke, the ground slick with blood, and every explosion from above showered dust on the makeshift operating tables below. One survivor later recalled that their textbooks were replaced by scalpels, and their ink-stained fingers became stained with blood. Instead of learning Latin names of organs, they were taught how to amputate a leg with a saw, how to hold down a soldier screaming without anesthesia, how to improvise bandages from their own clothes. Some girls fainted the first time they were asked to carry buckets filled not with water, but with severed limbs, and yet they endured. They endured because they had been told that endurance was their sacred duty. Many still wrote in their diaries small, fragile pages hidden in their pockets about their dreams of becoming doctors or teachers after the war. Those dreams kept them going when the food rations shrank to little more than rice mixed with sawdust, when exhaustion hollowed their faces, when fear seemed to be the only constant companion. The lesson here is simple but profound. Beliefs shape endurance. These young women endured horrors beyond imagination because they believed their sacrifices were part of a larger destiny. But belief without truth can be dangerous. It can trap the innocent in a story that was never theirs to write. And that is exactly what happened when they first met the Americans. Because everything they had been taught about the enemy, that Americans were starving, weak, incapable of sacrifice, would be tested the moment the war reached the caves. To understand how shocking that moment would be, we need to step into the world of propaganda that had shaped them, a world where radios and classrooms painted America as a nation on the brink of collapse, and where every young girl believed she was living in a story that would end in Japan's inevitable triumph. 2. Propaganda education. Americans as starving weaklings. Every morning in the classrooms of Okinawa, the ritual was the same. The students lined up in neat rows, bowed to the portrait of the emperor, and sang patriotic hymns about Japan's sacred destiny. After that came the lessons not only about math or literature, but about the enemy. The teachers told them that America was collapsing under the strain of war. The radio crackled with confident voices claiming that US soldiers were starving, surviving only on grass and tree bark. Newspapers published triumphant reports that Japanese submarines had cut off America's supply lines, leaving their cities in famine and their farms abandoned. One textbook even described American children growing thin and weak, crying for food their parents could not provide. For the young women of the Himeyuri Student Corps, these were not just stories. They were truths repeated so often, so confidently, that doubting them would have seemed like betrayal. If America was weak, then Japan's hardships, shortages of rice, sugar, even soap were bearable. If the enemy was already collapsing, then every sacrifice had meaning. There were moments that made these claims feel real. A girl named Sachiko remembered how her family's dinner shrank from bowls of rice and fish to watery soup flavored with seaweed. When her teacher reassured the class that Americans were suffering far worse, Sachiko felt a strange comfort. If they are weaker than us, then surely we can endure. The power of propaganda is not in its loudness, but in its familiarity. When the same message is whispered in classrooms, repeated on the radio, and sung in songs, it becomes invisible like the air people breathe. It becomes the foundation on which they build their hopes and expectations. And yet, the foundation was built on sand. While Japanese families were stretching a few spoonfuls of rice with ground corn husks, American farms were producing more wheat, corn, and milk than ever before. While Japanese children were growing thinner, American soldiers overseas were receiving rations of bread, meat, fruit, and even sweets. The contrast could not have been sharper, but inside those Okinawan classrooms, no one could imagine it. The lesson here is this: propaganda doesn't only twist facts, it fills the gaps left by fear. For these girls, believing that Americans were starving gave meaning to their own hunger. It gave purpose to their suffering. But when a lie is used to give purpose, the truth, when it finally arrives, can be devastating. And that truth was about to arrive, not in textbooks or radio broadcasts, but in the form of real encounters. Because soon, the Himeyuri students would see the wounded soldiers they were meant to heal. Soldiers who were not the invincible warriors of the morning songs, but broken men with hollow eyes and empty stomachs. To understand how propaganda unraveled, we must first look at the battlefield reality these young women walked into: the collapse of Japanese medical services on Okinawa, where shortages of food, medicine, and hope made every day a test of survival. 3. Collapse of Japanese medical services on Okinawa. When the Himeyuri girls first stepped into the caves, they thought they were entering hospitals. What they found instead were places where medicine itself seemed to have died. At the start, the teachers and doctors tried to keep up appearances. They gave the girls white armbands with red crosses, told them they were now nurses, and reassured them that supplies would come. But the promises faded quickly. By April, morphine had vanished. By May, even simple disinfectants were gone. Operations that should have been moments of healing became scenes of horror. One student remembered holding down a soldier's shoulders as a doctor sawed through his leg without anesthesia. His screams echoed in the cave long after the surgery ended, haunting her dreams for years. Another wrote in her diary about using the same bandage 3, even 4 times, rinsing it in muddy water between patients until the cloth nearly disintegrated. Food was no better. The rice rations shrank to a few spoonfuls a day, sometimes mixed with sawdust or bitter roots for bulk. Soldiers who had once been described as invincible warriors now looked like shadows, their cheeks hollow, their uniforms hanging loose. One girl recalled that when a soldier begged for food, she could only hand him half a rice ball, whispering an apology as his eyes filled with tears. The contrast between what they had been taught and what they now saw was unbearable. These were not heroes marching toward victory, they were young men barely clinging to life. And the girls, still teenagers, were expected to patch them together with nothing but torn shirts and whispered prayers. The lesson here is both painful and universal. War does not always collapse with a bang. It often collapses with a slow starvation of resources, hope, and truth. For the Himeyuri girls, the real enemy was not the Americans they had never seen. It was hunger, disease, and the impossible task of healing without tools. And yet, even in the middle of despair, they clung to small acts of care. A student might hum a lullaby while cleaning a wound, or share her last scrap of sweet potato with a patient. These gestures were tiny, but they mattered. They were reminders that even in the ruins, humanity could survive. But nothing prepared them for what came next. After weeks of hunger and despair, the enemy they had been taught to fear finally appeared not as monsters, but as medics carrying bandages, medicines, and food. To the starving girls, the first American meals looked like a cruel trick until they took a bite. 4. American abundance arrives at the front. When the first American medics stepped into the caves of Okinawa, the Himeyuri girls braced for cruelty. They had been told to expect torture, humiliation, even death. Instead, what arrived was something they had not seen in months: supplies. The Americans carried crates of bandages still sealed in paper, bottles of antiseptic that smelled sharp and clean, and boxes of medicine labeled in English. To the girls, it felt like stepping from the Middle Ages into the modern world. One survivor remembered the shock of seeing rolls of gauze stacked neatly on a table. It was more than we had seen in 3 months of war. And then came the food. The first trays looked almost unreal: soft white bread that tore apart with a touch, steaming beef stew with chunks of carrot and potato, butter that was yellow and smooth, not the grey substitute the girls knew, fresh milk poured into tin cups. To the starving students, it felt like a feast from another world. One girl later confessed she couldn't believe it was real. She stared at the bread, convinced it must be made of clay. Another refused to touch the meat for days, thinking it was poisoned. But hunger won. And when they finally tasted it, the reaction was overwhelming. Some laughed, some cried, some sat in stunned silence. The Americans were not starving. They were not desperate. They were feeding their prisoners better than Japan had been able to feed its own soldiers. How was it possible? Behind every tray of food stood a supply chain as vast as an empire. U.S. convoys carried refrigerated ships filled with meat and dairy across the Pacific. Seabees construction battalions built kitchens and storage depots almost as soon as the beaches were secure. Field rations like the K ration or C ration were standardized, mass-produced, and distributed with an efficiency Japan could never match. Where Japanese supply lines had collapsed under submarine warfare and bombing, American logistics seemed endless. For the Himeyuri girls, each bite of bread was more than nourishment, it was proof. Proof that the world they had been told about in classrooms and radio broadcasts was false. Proof that the war they had believed Japan could win was already lost. The lesson is clear. Abundance is not just about wealth, it is about systems, organization, and priorities. America's strength did not only lie in its weapons, but in its ability to feed, clothe, and care for millions of men at war, and even the enemies who fell into its hands. But abundance created a new problem for the Americans. How should they classify and care for these young women? They were not exactly soldiers, not exactly civilians. The answer would place the Himeyuri students in a legal and moral grey zone caught between the rules of war and the realities of survival. 5. POW processing and legal grey zones. When the fighting on Okinawa ended for these young women, they expected the worst. To surrender was, in their minds, to abandon honor. Some believed they would be executed on the spot. Others whispered that Americans would use them for experiments. None imagined being treated as something so ordinary as prisoners. But even for the Americans, these girls did not fit neatly into a category. They wore white armbands with red crosses, but most were students, not trained nurses. They had carried no weapons, yet they had worked directly in military caves. Were they combatants? Were they civilians? Or something in between? International law offered little guidance. The 1929 Geneva Convention, accepted in Europe, defined the treatment of prisoners of war, but Japan had never signed it. And the Pacific War, brutal on both sides, had rarely followed such rules. American commanders now faced a dilemma: what to do with hundreds of teenage girls who had been serving under the Japanese army, but who were clearly not soldiers. In practice, compassion often guided the answer. The girls were placed in makeshift facilities near American medical stations. They were given clean beds, sometimes the first mattresses they had seen in months. Doctors treated their malnutrition and disease. Interpreters tried to reassure them, though mistrust lingered. One medic remembered a girl who refused to lie on her bed, convinced it was a trick. She curled up on the floor until another nurse coaxed her gently, showing her that the bed was not a trap but a gift. These small acts of humanity began to chip away at years of fear. At the same time, U.S. intelligence officers recognized something important: these women carried knowledge. Unlike captured soldiers trained to give nothing but name and rank, the Himeyuri students could speak about Japanese schools, hospitals, food shortages, even morale at home. They were witnesses to a collapsing society. Every casual conversation, every slip of memory, was a window into the enemy's true condition. The lesson here is subtle but vital. Sometimes the greatest value of a prisoner is not military secrets, but human truth. In treating the Himeyuri girls not as faceless enemies, but as people, the Americans gained more than compliance, they gained insight. And that insight often came not in interrogation rooms, but in dining halls. Because it was over shared meals, bread, butter, and chocolate, that the most profound exchanges took place, and where the lies of propaganda dissolved bite by bite. 6. Food as psychological weapon and intelligence, gold mine. The first shared meals were filled with silence. The Himeyuri girls sat at long tables in a converted school building, staring at trays that looked too generous to be real. Steaming beef stew, fresh bread, even small squares of chocolate for dessert. Some girls touched the food but didn't eat. Others whispered suspicions. It must be poisoned. It's a trick to make us talk. One girl, Tomoko, kept her resolve for days. She ate only the plain rice, pushing the meat and butter aside. She told herself that accepting such luxuries was a betrayal of her fallen comrades. But hunger is a patient teacher. When she finally took a small bite of meat, she broke down in tears, not from the taste, but from what it meant. If Americans could feed their prisoners this well, what did that say about everything she had been told? For American doctors and intelligence officers, those meals became opportunities. They didn't press the girls with harsh questions. Instead, they let conversations flow over soup and bread. In that relaxed space, the women spoke more freely. They described the hospitals back home, where bandages had to be boiled and reused until they fell apart. They spoke of rations in Japan, barely 1,000 calories a day, sometimes less. They mentioned the fear that even medical students were fainting from malnutrition. For analysts, this was gold. These were not rehearsed propaganda speeches. These were unguarded truths, spoken between bites of stew. Each story painted a clearer picture of Japan's collapse: famine, disease, shortages, information far more valuable than any military map. One American psychiatrist later wrote that the food itself was the most powerful interrogator. A warm meal broke down suspicion faster than any question. Bread crusts left uneaten, butter casually spread on toast, chocolate handed out like candy. These were daily reminders of abundance and daily challenges to the propaganda the girls had believed all their lives. The lesson here is this: kindness can be strategic. By feeding their enemies well, the Americans not only fulfilled a moral duty, they created an atmosphere where truth could surface naturally. In the war of information, Humanity turned out to be the sharpest weapon. But the revelations did not end there. Soon, new groups of female prisoners arrived, not just students from Okinawa, but trained nurses and medical staff from Japan's cities. And what they carried with them were stories even more shocking. Stories from the heart of the home islands, where hunger and collapse had reached a breaking point. 7. Voices from the home islands. By the summer of 1945, new prisoners began arriving in American custody. Unlike the Himeyuri students, these women had not been hidden away in caves on Okinawa. They came from the Japanese mainland itself, trained nurses, pharmacists, and supervisors who had seen the war's collapse from the inside. One of them was Hanako Suzuki, a nurse supervisor from Kobe. At 28, she was older than most of the girls, with over a decade of medical experience. When she sat down for her first meal in an American facility, she wept openly. On her tray was bread as white as snow, butter that actually smelled fresh, crisp vegetables, and tender beef. She told her American caretakers, "I had not seen food like this in 3 years." Her words were not exaggeration. Back in Kobe, the official civilian ration had fallen to less than 1,000 calories per day. But even those meager rations often failed to arrive because transport lines were destroyed by American bombing. Families lined up for hours for a few ounces of millet or potatoes. Children fainted at school. Nurses in hospitals sometimes received less food than their patients. The contrast with American abundance was staggering. A U.S. soldier in 1945 received roughly 3,600 calories per day, often in the form of rations that included canned meat, powdered eggs, chocolate, and even fruit juice. While Japanese nurses were sterilizing bandages in salty water, American hospitals had warehouses full of sterile gauze and anesthetics. Hanako spoke of hospitals in Japan where operations were performed without morphine, where medical students collapsed from hunger during training, and where even basic drugs like aspirin had disappeared. To her, the American dining hall was not just a place to eat, it was a vision of a world she could scarcely imagine. The lesson is stark. Strength is not measured only in courage, but in capacity. Japan's soldiers fought with fierce determination, but determination could not replace food, medicine, or fuel. America's power came not only from its weapons, but from the simple fact that it could nourish both its troops and its prisoners. And yet, the most painful revelation was still to come. For these women soon learned that Japan's leaders had known about America's strength all along and had chosen war anyway. The discovery that their suffering had been born not of ignorance, but of deliberate deception, would shake their faith to its core. 8. The bigger picture. Why leaders knew and lead. For the Himeyuri students and captured nurses, the shock of American abundance was almost unbearable. But what cut even deeper was the truth they began to learn in captivity. Japan's leaders had not been blind. They had known. Before the war, Japanese delegations had toured American farms and factories. Officials had seen wheat fields stretching to the horizon in Kansas, assembly lines in Detroit producing cars at a speed unimaginable in Tokyo, and universities where research in chemistry and engineering pushed boundaries every year. Reports sent back to Tokyo spoke of America's vast resources: coal, oil, steel, farmland, and its unmatched capacity to mobilize industry. And yet, the decision had been made to go to war. Not out of ignorance, but out of belief. Japanese leaders convinced themselves that Americans were too soft, too spoiled by luxury, to fight a long war. They gambled that Japan's spiritual strength would outlast America's material wealth. For the captured women, this was devastating to hear. One nurse asked bitterly, "If they knew, why did they send us into caves with no medicine? Why did they let children starve, telling us the enemy was weaker than us?" The realization was more painful than hunger. It meant that their sacrifices had been demanded not because victory was possible, but because pride refused surrender. The lesson here is sobering. Wars are often lost not by those who fight them, but by those who misjudge their enemies. Courage cannot fill an empty stomach. Faith cannot replace fuel or medicine. And when leaders choose pride over reality, it is always the innocent who pay the price. For American audiences, this moment resonates strongly. It highlights not just victory in battle, but the triumph of preparation, logistics, and realism over ideology and illusion. And yet, as crushing as this realization was, the war itself was not over. In August 1945, new forces even more overwhelming than food or industry, would arrive on the stage. The atomic bomb and the Soviet entry into the war would confirm what these women had already begun to sense, that Japan could not win, and that surrender was inevitable. The 9th of August, 1945. From abundance to annihilation. By August 1945, the war had already ended in the hearts of many of the captured women. They had seen too much: the endless supplies of the Americans, the steady collapse of Japan's hospitals, the emptiness of propaganda. Still, when news reached them of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the shock was overwhelming. One girl remembered the moment an American officer, gently but firmly, explained what had happened. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. She thought it was impossible. For years, she had been told Japan was developing secret weapons, that America was on the brink of collapse. Now she was confronted with a reality so vast it was beyond imagination. America had not only abundance, but power unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Soviet entry into the war deepened the despair. For generations, the Japanese had feared invasion from the north. Now, with the Red Army pouring into Manchuria, it seemed Japan was surrounded from every direction. The illusion of control of fighting a defensive, noble war crumbled in an instant. For the Himeyuri girls, these events felt almost personal. They had already surrendered their faith in propaganda when they tasted American chocolate and bread. Now they surrendered the last fragile hope that Japan could somehow endure. As one nurse whispered to her friend after hearing of Hiroshima, "If they can destroy a city in a day, how can we protect our homes, our families?" The lesson here is clear. Truth arrives in waves. First, in small moments, a piece of chocolate, a tray of stew, then in larger revelations, stories from the home islands, shortages, lies. And finally, in undeniable shocks, atomic fire and Soviet armies. Each wave strips away illusion until only reality remains. And yet, even in the middle of this collapse, something remarkable began to happen. These young women, who had once feared the Americans as monsters, started to see them as human beings, nurses, medics, fellow caregivers. They began to realize that their future might not be built on hate, but on understanding. And so, when the Emperor's voice finally announced surrender on August 15th, these women, once girls in school uniforms, found themselves in an unexpected role, not just as prisoners, but as bridges between two nations, carrying with them the memory of chocolate, bread, and kindness shown even in war. 10. Resolution. From propaganda victims to bridges of peace. When Emperor Hirohito's voice finally came over the radio on August 15th, 1945, the Himeyuri girls listened in stunned silence. For the first time, they heard their godlike leader speak, and his words were not of victory, but surrender. The war, they had been told, was unwinnable for the Americans had ended in Japan's unconditional defeat. For these young women, now prisoners in American care, the announcement did not bring humiliation. It brought clarity. They had already seen with their own eyes that Japan could not outlast America's abundance, its logistics, its technology. The chocolate bar, the bread and butter, the endless bandages, each had been a quiet prophecy of this moment. In the weeks that followed, many of the girls began to take on unexpected roles. Some served as translators for American medics. Others used their nursing skills to assist in caring for wounded soldiers, regardless of uniform. They became, in their own quiet way, bridges between enemies. After the war, many carried these lessons into their lives. Sachiko Yamamoto returned to Okinawa and eventually became the head of nursing at a major hospital, later starting exchange programs with American nurses. Hanako Suzuki dedicated her life to international medical cooperation, helping organize humanitarian missions across Asia. What began with despair in the caves of Okinawa grew into a lifelong commitment to peace. The lesson here reaches far beyond 1945. Propaganda may divide, but shared humanity can heal. These women had been told Americans were weak, cruel, and starving. Instead, they found care, compassion, and food more abundant than anything they had ever known. The lies collapsed, and what remained was truth, a truth that reshaped not only how they saw the enemy, but how they saw themselves. And so, their story leaves us with a question worth carrying today. In a world still full of propaganda, fear, and division, what small acts of kindness might break through the noise? If a piece of chocolate could undo years of indoctrination, what might a simple gesture of humanity accomplish in our own time? Because in the end, the most powerful weapons are not always bombs or bullets. Sometimes they are bread, chocolate, and the courage to treat an enemy as a fellow human being. This is the story of the Himeyuri girls, their journey from caves of despair to bridges of peace. If their story moved you, share it. Remember it. And join us here, on Echoes of World War II, as we uncover more hidden stories of the war. Stories that remind us not just of how it was fought, but of how humanity endured.